In 2006, the world saw the debut of a brand new James Bond and the release of Daniel Craig's Casino Royale, a movie that shocked the world and broke out from the already high expectations everyone had for a James Bond movie. But when the movie came out, it was so good, so transformative, so iconoclastic that it ended up transcending its genre of spy thriller and single-handedly elevating it to a higher level. You know, there are only a handful of movies that have been able to do that for me. My personal favorites include The Godfather, Star Wars, Superman the movie, The Dark Knight, and of course for me, the 2006 Casino Royale. I was already a huge fan of the James Bond franchise, and I thought I knew what the 007 franchise was about. I'd watched almost every James Bond movie on opening night since Moonraker. But then came Casino Royale, which was more than a Bond movie, it was an out-of-body experience. Director Martin Campbell and actor Daniel Craig weaved a narrative dream that transported me to another world. But to understand this movie and how important it was, let's examine how we got here. Ian Fleming had created the character of James Bond in 1953 when he published the novel Casino Royale. And in the novel, M, the head of British Secret Service, sends James Bond, code 007, to play baccarat against a bankrupt Le Chiffre at the Royale les Eaux casino in northern France. And unlike the movie, the entire novel takes place in the casino. We learn through flashbacks that Le Chiffre was a paymaster for the Soviet Union and was entrusted with 50 million francs of Smersh's money. However, he misused those funds by investing in a chain of French brothels with the plan of making money and using the brothels for himself. He would then be able to make a fortune, pay back Smersh, and keep a massive fortune for himself. However, a new moralistic legislation outlawed prostitution and caused the closure of Le Chiffre's brothels, leading to Le Chiffre owing Smersh 50 million French francs, which is about $143 US, about $1.7 million when adjusted for inflation, much less than the $100 million of the movie. Bond goes to the Royale les Eaux casino with the cover of being a rich Jamaican playboy, probably a self-insert since Ian Fleming himself was a playboy living in Jamaica. And M assigns Vesper Lynd to accompany him. He plays against Le Chiffre, and the game gets intense, but Le Chiffre wins the first round, draining Bond of all his funds. He's about to report to M of his failure, but CIA agent Felix Leiter gives him an envelope with the note Marshal Aid, which contains 32 million French francs, allowing Bond to continue. One of Le Chiffre's men try to kill Bond by threatening him with a silencer hidden in a cane, but Bond pretends to faint, falls back in his chair, and disarms the man. Bond wins the game and takes all of Le Chiffre's money. Le Chiffre kidnaps Vesper Lynd, which is a trap to kidnap Bond, and Le Chiffre tortures Bond by smashing his genitals with a carpet beater. However, during the torture, a Smersh assassin enters and kills Le Chiffre as punishment for losing the money. He leaves Bond alive, saying he doesn't have orders to kill him, but carves a acrylic spy on his hand, making him easy to detect in the future. Bond recuperates in the hospital, and Vesper visits him every day, and Bond falls in love with Vesper and plans to leave the Secret Service and settle down with her. However, a mysterious man named Gettler is tracking them, and this disturbs Vesper, who commits suicide. And with her dying breath, she admits that she'd been working with Smersh as an unwilling double agent because Smersh had kidnapped her boyfriend, who was a Polish Air Force pilot. And she was being blackmailed into undermining Bond's mission, including faking her own kidnapping. Bond informs the Secret Service of Vesper's betrayal, and the novel ends with him telling them, Vesper, Agent 3030, was a double, working for Redland. Yes, damn it, I said was. The bitch is dead now. The book was a critical success and sold out in less than a month, and the second printing also sold out in a month, and a huge third printing also sold out, so Kate Publishing offered Ian Fleming a 3-book deal. The next year, Ian Fleming sold the rights to Casino Royale to CBS for $1,000, worth $12,000 today when adjusted for inflation. And CBS turned it into a 1-hour episode for their Climax series and cast Barry Nelson as an American named Jimmy Bond, and cast Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. The next year, in 1955, Ian Fleming sold the rights to Casino Royale to producer Gregory Radoff for $6,000, worth $72,000 when adjusted for inflation. In 1961, two Hollywood tycoons, Albert R. Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, acquired the rights to the James Bond character and made their first James Bond movie with unknown actor Sean Connery. The film was 1962's Dr. No, and it was a breakout smash success, and Dr. No became one of the most successful films of the year. This was followed by From Russia with Love, which was another smash hit. However, it was the third film, the 1964 Goldfinger, that turned James Bond and the niche genre of spy thrillers into an international phenomenon. Not only was Goldfinger everywhere, but every movie in Hollywood was a spy thriller, and James Bond had arrived. In 1967, producer Charles K. Feldman acquired the rights for Casino Royale from Gary Randolph after his death, and Columbia Pictures produced the 1967 satirical version of Casino Royale with David Niven as Bond, Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, Orson Welles, and Woody Allen. However, in 1967, during the filming of You Only Live Twice, 007 actor Sean Connery quit the role and was replaced by George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. However, he left the role after one film. Sean Connery returned for one more movie, Diamonds Are Forever, but vowed never to play the character again. Enter Roger Moore, who debuted with Live and Let Die and would go on to play 007 for 7 films, more than any other actor. The Roger Moore era had its highs with The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only, and it had its lows with The Man with the Golden Gun and A View to a Kill. But those of us in Generation X, he was our introduction to James Bond, and he's the reason why we're all 007 fans to this day. In 1987, he was replaced by Pierce Brosnan, who then lost the role when Remington Steele would not release him from his contract, so Timothy Dalton came on board with The Living Daylights. However, in 1989, his movie License to Kill ended up being the lowest performing James Bond movie. By the early 1990s, James Bond was a near-dead franchise, and actor Timothy Dalton even predicted that James Bond as a character and as a movie franchise would likely not be around in 5 years. An MGM survey of teenagers found that most teenagers in 1990 did not even know who James Bond was, and those that knew associated him as a character that their fathers liked. For the modern action hero, the younger generation thought of movies like Die Hard, Commando, Terminator, Batman, or Indiana Jones, not James Bond, and MGM wanted to change that. For James Bond to survive, he would need to appeal to this younger audience. In 1994, Eon hired a relatively unknown New Zealand director named Martin Campbell to introduce the world to a new James Bond, portrayed by a dashing young and insanely handsome Pierce Brosnan, the man who almost portrayed him 8 years earlier. The 1995 film GoldenEye was a breakout success and invigorated the franchise. Pierce Brosnan breathed new life into the 007 franchise, and a whole new generation of Bond fans were created, and many considered GoldenEye as one of the best James Bond films in the entire franchise. His next 2 films, Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough, were huge successes, although they did fail to have the same impact as GoldenEye. But then came the 2002 Die Another Day, which was coming out at the 40th anniversary of the Bond film franchise. So Eon Films and director Lee Tamahori pulled out all the stops and created what they thought would be the quintessential James Bond movie. A movie that would be so over the top, so James Bond in all its levels, that there was no way it wouldn't be anything but a total hit. It had hovercrafts, it had lasers, it had invisible cars, it had North Koreans posing as Europeans, it had villains in electronic bodysuits that shot out electricity, and it had Halle Berry as a female version of James Bond who said things like, "Who sent you?" and "Yo mama." And it had the infamous scene of James Bond parasailing to a computer-generated tsunami. It had dialed its camp up to 11. And on top of that, it had very questionable CGI that was clearly overused. And despite it being a very financially successful film, it was exactly what die-hard Bond fans did not want. Then, after a 4-year hiatus, why a 4-year hiatus? Well, we'll go into that in a few minutes. But after a 4-year hiatus, the Bond franchise reemerged with a new movie and a new James Bond. And we were not happy about it initially. We didn't want a new James Bond, we wanted Pierce Brosnan. And so what if he made a turkey of a Bond film? He made 3 good ones, and he was great in all 4 of them. Plus, he had starred in GoldenEye, which was one of the greatest Bond films of all time. He was James Bond 007, period. We wanted a 5th Pierce Brosnan film. Hell, we wanted 4 more Pierce Brosnan films. Plus this new guy, Daniel Craig, he wasn't handsome, he wasn't dashing. He was blonde. But boy, were we wrong. Due to the financial success of Die Another Day, Eon Films greenlit the 21st James Bond movie with Pierce Brosnan, and it was a given that this was going to be Pierce Brosnan's 5th James Bond movie. After all, Pierce Brosnan was the face of James Bond during the 90s, which was the most financially successful era of James Bond since the early Sean Connery years. Plus, he had successfully introduced a whole new generation to James Bond, a generation who had, previous to Pierce Brosnan, considered James Bond a character that their fathers liked. Pierce Brosnan made James Bond cool to the younger generation. In other words, during pre-production of Bond 21, there was no way the movie studio businessmen of MGM would risk Bond being played by anyone besides Pierce Brosnan. So why did the studio suddenly go with a new actor? And the real story may surprise you. You've probably heard that they wanted to go into a more grounded direction after The Ridiculous Die Another Day. You may have heard that MGM wanted a younger actor to reboot the origin of Bond. And these are reasonable reasons and totally make sense, but they are wrong. Well, they're not true. And I'm going to tell you the real reason why MGM did not go with Pierce Brosnan and went with a new actor. And that story is very convoluted and actually involves Spider-Man. In the 1980s, Marvel Comics was struggling and sold the rights to Spider-Man to the Cannon Group, who then sold it to Coralco Films. And during this time, Columbia Pictures desperately wanted to make a Spider-Man movie and even pegged James Cameron as a potential director, but they were unsuccessful in getting the rights. And in 1996, Coralco Films went bankrupt and they were purchased by MGM. And as of 1996, there had yet to be a Spider-Man movie. Meanwhile, in 1996, Columbia Pictures, owned by Sony, owned the rights to Casino Royale. Because remember, in 1954, Ian Fleming desperately wanted to make money off of his James Bond character and had sold the rights to his first novel, Casino Royale, to CBS, which they turned into a 1-hour episode for their TV anthology called Climax. And it starred American Barry Nelson as Jimmy Bond, a British Felix Leiter, and Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. Ian Fleming hated this adaptation and vowed never to involve James Bond in any more incompetent productions. And the rights to Casino Royale floated around Hollywood for years, and in 1967, a producer named Charles K. Feldman snatched up the rights to Casino Royale and made the spoof comedy movie with Peter Sellers, David Niven, and Woody Allen. And if you're interested in that story, please check out my video on the 1967 Casino Royale, and I'll post a link in the description below. Now, this story proper starts with a company called Sony. You know, we all know Sony.
Sony. Sony?
Who had purchased Columbia Pictures in 1989. And Columbia Pictures owned the rights to the 1967 Casino Royale, hence the rights to the Casino Royale book. And because Columbia Pictures owned the rights and Sony owned Columbia Pictures, Sony owned the rights to Casino Royale. And in fact, it was always a sore spot to Cubby Broccoli that he didn't own the rights to Ian Fleming's first novel and could never make a movie about Bond's origin story. Well, in 1998, MGM and Eon Films, with Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, sued Columbia Pictures Sony in an attempt to get the rights to Casino Royale. And in 1999, in an out-of-court settlement, Sony agreed to give MGM the rights to Casino Royale, and MGM agreed to give Sony the rights to Spider-Man. And Columbia Pictures Sony immediately began their plans to make their first Spider-Man movie, which would become the Tobey Maguire film directed by Sam Raimi. And as for MGM, finally, after over 40 years, Eon Films could make a movie based on Casino Royale. Meanwhile, it was given that Pierce Brosnan was their James Bond, but Brosnan had a 4-film contract to play 007, so they had to negotiate for him to be in the 5th movie, which looked like it was going to be Casino Royale. And they were discussing salaries in the $20 million to $30 million range, and appeared the magic number being discussed was $30 million. And this meant the whole dance of negotiation, where Pierce Brosnan would say that he's not interested in playing Bond, and Eon would say that they're auditioning other actors, and then they'd eventually settle on a salary.
Negotiation. This is what you do in business.
Well, while they were doing this dance of negotiation, some interesting business intrigue occurred. First, MGM owner Kurt Kerkhovian was trying to make money by putting MGM up for sale. And this story is going to involve Sony, who had just gotten out of the James Bond business, but they're going to find themselves back in bed with 007. Sony, which was one of the biggest and most powerful and well-respected companies in the world, had started to see a dip in profits by the year 2000. Their big seller, the Sony Walkman, had become obsolete thanks to an Apple product called the iPod. Meanwhile, their flat-screen plasma TV was actually being beaten by two other companies, Samsung and Gateway, making Sony the number 3 seller of plasma TVs. The only successful item that Sony had was the PlayStation video game system, known as the PS2. Sony wanted another successful item, and they leaned hard into their Blu-ray technology. Sony had been working on their Blu-ray technology since 1998, and in October 2000, Sony debuted their first Blu-ray prototype at the Combined Exhibition of Advanced Technology annual trade show. On February 19, 2002, they trademarked their Blue Disc logo, and on February 19, 2002, they officially announced their Blu-ray disc player. However, Toshiba was also working on their own high-disc player called HD DVD, and Sony was worried about a format war with Toshiba, Blu-ray versus HD DVD. Sony was familiar with the format war because in 1974 there were two formats of videotapes, RCA and Panasonic releasing their VHS and Sony releasing their Betamax. However, despite Sony having the superior product and releasing their Betamax 1 year earlier, they never stood a chance, and by 1987, VHS accounted for 90% of the videotape market, and by 1988, Sony began to make VHS players. This time, Sony would be ready for their Blu-ray HD DVD format war. Movie studios began to pick sides, and Warner Brothers, Paramount, DreamWorks, and Universal aligned with HD DVD, while Disney, 20th Century Fox, and Lionsgate aligned with Blu-ray. On April 10, 2003, Sony released their Blu-ray called the Sony BDZ S77, which was available only in Japan. However, the format wars would really be fought in the United States. HD DVD released their first players in June of 2006, and Blu-ray was announced in the US in September of 2006. So Sony really wanted to get into increasing their movie library in anticipation of the 2006 format war, in order to push their Blu-ray discs. And it was at this time that MGM owner Kurt Kerkorian offered MGM up for sale, and Sony wanted the MGM library of over 5,000 movies, which in addition to their library of Columbia Pictures, would give them a huge selection of movies to push their Blu-ray disc concept. Owning the movie library of Columbia Pictures, which in 2003 consisted of Ghostbusters, Men in Black, Karate Kid, and now Spider-Man, adding the library of MGM, Sony could make these movies exclusive to Blu-ray and basically drive HD DVD to bankruptcy. Sony would be ready for this format war. Sony pushed their PlayStation 3 with the Blu-ray player very hard, while Xbox threw their hat in with HD DVD. In 2008, Blockbuster Video did an analysis and found out that Blu-ray discs were being rented out at a rate of 2-to-1 over HD DVD discs. And so they decided to go completely with Blu-ray. And soon Walmart followed and only began to carry Blu-ray players, which was the death nail for HD DVD. And by 2008, HD DVD essentially disappeared as a concept. And sure, Sony was interested in MGM's total library of 5,000 films, but the three franchises they really wanted was Rocky, Pink Panther, and James Bond. And so Sony gathered money to try to purchase MGM and begin production of a James Bond movie, a Rocky movie, and a Pink Panther movie. So it's no coincidence that in 2006 we got 007's Casino Royale, Rocky Balboa, and a new Pink Panther movie starring Steve Martin as Inspector Clouseau. However, Sony could not afford to buy MGM outright. They simply didn't have enough money, so they went to Wall Street and gathered a consortium of investors to do it, and this big group of Wall Street investors bought MGM. It's important to know that Sony did not own MGM. Sony was simply a shareholder in a separate company that owned MGM. And that separate company, called MGM, started making movies. James Bond, Rocky, and the Pink Panther. And so this MGM consortium immediately greenlit to make Casino Royale and approved a 2-film deal to distribute Casino Royale and its sequel film, now known as Bond 22, which will eventually become Quantum of Solace. However, these Wall Street investors and the banks now in charge of MGM had to slash the budget of these movies. And this is where Pierce Brosnan is going to suffer the most. Die Another Day was made for $150 million, while Bond 21, which looked like is going to be Casino Royale, its budget was slashed over 40% to a budget of around $85 million. And it's even rumored that they made the film for $72 million, despite the official number Eon would release as saying that it was $150 million. And the reason why they did this is, of course, had to pretend that the budget of the consecutive films was, at the very least, consistent. Well, with a budget of $72 million, they could no longer afford Pierce Brosnan's salary demand of $30 million, which would have already broken the bank. In fact, they even refused to give Brosnan the absolute minimum he asked for of $20 million. And therefore, they had to get rid of Pierce Brosnan and go with an unknown, a much cheaper unknown, one they would eventually end up paying $3 million. And so, that's it. That's why Brosnan was out. It had nothing to do with Eon going in a more serious direction. It had nothing to do with rebooting the franchise with a younger star. And it had everything to do with money. Money that Sony and this new consortium of investors that owned MGM were unwilling to pay. So in 2003, Pierce Brosnan was in the Bahamas filming After the Sunset when he heard the bad news from his agent. And the next week, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson called Brosnan, and she was apparently crying and said, "Oh, we're so sorry." Michael G. Wilson then added, "You were a great James Bond." And Pierce Brosnan was shocked and devastated they went in a new direction. And to this day, whenever you see Brosnan in interviews talking about James Bond, he still seems bitter and upset that he never got to do a fifth James Bond movie. And yes, legendary Pulp Fiction director Quentin Tarantino became involved in the project, and he regularly met with Barbara Broccoli and Michael J. Wilson, and he had this idea, which was a little different and a little experimental, and he thought it would be cool to do an origin story of James Bond, but he'd do it in a film noir format done completely in black and white, and he wanted Pierce Brosnan to play Bond. But even though it's an origin story, it would play a little bit with the inconsistency in the chronology. I mean, it would be the Pierce Brosnan a few years after Die Another Day, but it would take place in the 50s, and it would be a black and white movie. Interestingly, what we do know is that Quentin Tarantino was not planning on directing this Casino Royale film. And this is because Quentin Tarantino was not a member of the Directors Guild and had no intention of joining the guild at that time. And the Eon producers Broccoli and Wilson, being part of MGM UA, would have had to file for an exemption had Quentin Tarantino directed this movie. They have to use Directors Guild directors, and of course, the guild would have likely denied the exemption. So based on the information, Quentin Tarantino did not want to be involved as director, he just wanted to help produce the movie. Now, interestingly enough, Quentin Tarantino did end up joining the Directors Guild in 2012 after Django Unchained. Well, Quentin Tarantino only wanted to get involved with Casino Royale, aka Bond 21, if it starred Pierce Brosnan. And since Brosnan was out, Quentin Tarantino also left the project. For screenwriter Neal Purvis and Robert Wade, who had written The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day, wrote the script for Casino Royale. In the later interviews, Neal Purvis and Robert Wade confirmed that they were writing Casino Royale for Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan was still a James Bond, and they wrote the film with Pierce Brosnan in mind. For director, Eon was able to rehire Martin Campbell, who directed GoldenEye, which was Pierce Brosnan's debut film. However, Martin Campbell did not like the script by Neal Purvis and Paul Wade and asked his friend Paul Haggis to write a second draft. And Paul Haggis is the creator of Walker, Texas Ranger with Chuck Norris and had written the screenplays for 2004's $1 Million Baby and the 2005 Crash, which would earn him back-to-back Academy Awards. And Paul Haggis wanted to do for the Bond franchise what Christopher Nolan had just done with Batman Begins, which had just come out on June 15th, 2005, as Paul Haggis was being hired for Casino Royale rewrites. So you have this well-known established intellectual property in Batman, similar to James Bond, and the previous Batman movies, despite having three different actors, Michael Keaton, Val Kilmer, and George Clooney, we accept this as one character in one world. However, in Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, Batman is played by Christian Bale, and he's a totally different Batman existing in a very different world. And that's what Paul Haggis wanted to do for Bond 21. He basically wanted to reboot James Bond as a completely new character. He also saw Die Another Day as being the Batman and Robin of the Bond franchise and wanted to return the film franchise to a more grounded and realistic movie. Also, in the original script by Neal, Purvis, and Paul Wade, Vesper Lynd confesses to Bond about her betrayal and unalives herself. And with her dying breath, she asks Bond to go after Mr. White's men. And Bond would chase them into a collapsing building. And Paul Haggis had a moment of inspiration where he felt that Vesper Lynd had to be in that falling, crumbling house. And that would be the moment of death. And therefore, he wrote the ending to what we now know as the ending of Casino Royale. Now, GoldenEye by Martin Campbell was fantastic, but here he's an even more polished director. He's more experienced, and he's working with an excellent Paul Haggis script, and it shows. So, at this time, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson and Martin Campbell had the daunting task of hiring and replacing Pierce Brosnan, and replace him with a relative unknown actor. Over 200 different actors were being considered for the role of the new James Bond, and Hugh Jackman was supposedly offered the role, but he declined. And apparently Christian Bale, the new Batman himself, was also offered the role, but he declined. Doug Ray Scott, who played the villain in Mission Impossible 2, who lost the role of Wolverine to Hugh Jackman, auditioned for the role, and Matthew Rhys also auditioned. And when Barbara Broccoli asked him, what would you do different as James Bond? Rhys was nervous and he joked, I'd give him a limp and an eye patch. And apparently the joke did not go over well and he was not considered for the role. And in 2013, Matthew Rhys would go on to a brilliant 6-season arc of his own as a super spy in The Americans. Other actors who were considered for James Bond include Julian McMahon, Ewan McGregor, Anthony Starr, Rupert Friend, among many, many others. Michael Fassbender auditioned, and after the audition, it was Michael Fassbender who suggested to Barbara Broccoli that Daniel Craig might be perfect for the role. And he later joked in interviews that he regretted promoting Daniel Craig for Bond and wished he had promoted himself more. But now we know that it really came down to 4 actors: Daniel Craig, Carl Urban, Sam Worthington, and Henry Cavill. Now, these 4 were considered the final 4 at that time. And they decided not to go with Henry Cavill because he was only 22 years old and way too young to play Bond. But it's kind of cool to think that the actor who'd go on to play Superman, the man everyone today wants as James Bond, was almost cast as 007 as early as 2004. Now, Carl Urban, who was famous for playing Bones McCoy in the new Star Trek franchise, had already committed himself to a film Out of the Blue, and he couldn't be in it, so it was really between Sam Worthington and Daniel Craig. In 2004, they approached Daniel Craig to play James Bond after seeing him in the 2004 film Layer Cake, and then the movie Munich. Barbara Broccoli loved Daniel Craig's intensity and felt that he could really pull off 007. But Daniel Craig turned it down, because Daniel Craig did not like the campy direction that the 007 movies were going into, and just didn't want to be involved. But Broccoli really wanted Craig, and so Barbara Broccoli handed Daniel Craig the official script of Casino Royale, and Daniel Craig loved it. And after reading the script, Craig made the deal with Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson to be the next James Bond. So to prepare for the role, Daniel Craig read all of Ian Fleming's novels, and he previously met with a lot of Mossad and British Secret Service agents while he was on the set of Munich. And he was fascinated by them, and he internalized a lot of their mannerisms, and he noticed that they all had this kind of look where they would scan the room at all times, and that there was this intensity to them that Craig incorporated into his performance as James Bond. And I think that's why James Bond appears so believable and authentic. Because when you see Daniel Craig's Bond, you really believe he is a genuine Secret Service agent, and that's because he got a lot of his performance from actual Secret Service agents. And I remember his announcement when they announced him on August 14th, 2005, there was huge fanfare. And you might remember this. I remember seeing it on Entertainment Weekly, and you see Daniel Craig with his semi-long hair riding a boat being accompanied by British soldiers. And I remember this, and of course, everyone lost their minds in a bad way, because people had said, no, we don't want a blonde James Bond. And they said he's too short, he's too ugly. And I have to admit, I was actually one of those people. And the newspapers even dubbed him James Blonde. Furthermore, we fans thought that Pierce Brosnan deserved another chance and really wanted to see a fifth Pierce Brosnan movie. So I really didn't want to see the film go in this direction. But boy, after the movie, was I proven wrong. Now, Daniel Craig was born in Cheshire, England. His mother was an art teacher and his father was in construction. And Craig enjoyed acting in school plays since the age of 6, and by 14 he was starring in high school plays. At age 16, he attended the National Youth Theater and financed his education by working in restaurants. He then entered the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and graduated in 1991, and he immediately got a small role in the 1992 film Power of One. He then landed small roles on American TV shows Zorro and The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, but his big breakout role came in 1996 as one of 4 protagonists of the BBC show Our Friends in the North, which led him to a starring as a lead in several more movies. He nabbed roles in Lara Croft Tomb Raider opposite Angelina Jolie and as an Irish mobster in Road to Perdition, and starred in dozens of movies, but it was his role as South African driver in Steven Spielberg's 2005 Munich that led to his role as James Bond. Eon then cast the actress to play Vesper Lynd, and numerous actresses were considered, and the 2 in the lead were Charlize Theron and Angelina Jolie, which is kind of weird to think about. They then offered the role to Rachel McAdams, who turned it down to spend more time with her family. And finally, it was down to Eva Green and Olivia Wilde. And they hired Eva Green at the last minute. And let's face it, she absolutely killed it in the movie. Eva Green was born in Paris, France, to a wealthy French family of famous actors, musicians, and doctors, and she is of Jewish descent. She was raised in France but attended the American University of Paris, an English-speaking private school. She then moved to London to study acting at the Weber Douglas Academy of Dramatic Art, and her first role was in Bernardo Bertolucci's 2003 film, The Dreamers, which led her to being cast in Ridley Scott's 2005 film, Kingdom of Heaven. And this is funny, she is actually a natural blonde and has apparently been dyeing her hair since age 15, and dyed her hair for this movie as well. Judi Dench returns as M, and she is the only cast member from the previous franchise to return in this movie. However, it is interesting that she plays M in a very different manner than her previous portrayal of M. It's a completely different character than she is in the previous Bonds. In Pierce Brosnan's Bond, she's very cold and played the role as an effective bureaucrat, a critical older sister. But here she plays it more maternal, as if she is James Bond's surrogate mother. And by this time, she owns the movie, and she really is the elder statesman of this production. And it is no wonder they officially made the 2 M's 2 different characters. In the Pierce Brosnan films, M's name is Barbara Maudsley, while in the Daniel Craig films, her name is Olivia Mansfield. Now, the 2 primary locations for filming was Prague in the Czech Republic and the Bahamas, with some minor shots in the UK, and the finale taking place in Venice, Italy. Now, for the scenes in Prague, they used Barrandov Studios, which is also the studio where Mission Impossible was filmed, Triple X, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Bourne Identity, The Shanghai Knights, and where they filmed Hellboy and G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra. The scene which takes place in Madagascar was actually also filmed in the Bahamas at a construction site in Coral Harbor in New Providence Island in the Bahamas. Now, I came to this movie as a cynic. I have to admit, I was one of the doubters because I was a huge fan of Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. And so I saw this movie in the second week of release, and I remember all my friends talking about this movie and how much they liked it. And I distinctly remember one of my friends saying how much he loved this film, and still to this day, in almost 20 years later, I remember his quote. He said, "He's more cruel and he's more sadistic than all the past Bonds, but somehow he's probably the most likable." And this is kind of a cool statement. I remember it intriguing me and made me want to see the movie. That was Friday night, 7 days after the movie had been released, and I was planning on watching this movie. Back in my old neighborhood, we had this big strip mall, Books A Million on one side, and the movie theater on the other. I parked my car at Books A Million, grabbed a cup of coffee, and walked to the movie theater to go see Casino Royale. And on my way to the theater, I saw another customer of Books A Million walking toward me. He was headed to Books A Million for a coffee. We knew each other, but we had never really hung out before. He politely said hi, and I politely said hi to him and told him that I was going to the theater to see the new James Bond movie, and I politely offered if he wanted to join me, and he did, and it was cool, and we actually both saw Casino Royale together, and after that, we sort of became friends from that day because of Casino Royale, and it's just a crazy random memory that I associate with this movie. Now, this movie starts out, oddly, it starts out in black and white, and even the MGM lion is in black and white, possibly an homage to Quentin Tarantino's early concept. And it does say that there is going to be something retro about this movie. And we immediately get that this is James Bond's origin story. This is a reboot, if you will. And we're going to see his first kill. And we learn that the 00 in 007 means 2 kills. And now for the first kill, we get this very intense and realistic fight scene. And it's a very well done fight scene. And we can see the influence of the 2002 film Bourne Identity. And Jason Bourne is an obvious homage to James Bond, the initials J and B being one direct homage. And the 2002 Bourne Identity had such intense and realistic fight scenes that some fans thought that the action sequences in Die Another Day were kind of lame. So the filmmakers wanted to make a statement with the action in this movie, and boy did they. And then we get another great scene where 007 goes for his second assassination, and he's going to assassinate this double agent named Dryden. And Dryden is trying to stall, and he talks about the Bond's first kill and says,
"Did you feel it, did he?"
The second is, and bang, 007 just shoots him in the head, and he says calmly, and it's great. I mean, it's bold, it's cruel, but it's so cool. It's just totally awesome. And within 5 minutes of this movie, I'm completely won over. And I realize that this is a level of wit, it's a level of screenwriting that maybe I hadn't ever seen in a James Bond movie before. And then we get a very interesting music montage. And for the first time, we don't get scantily clad women dancing, but we get an animated Bond fighting and shooting. And it's very interesting because when he shoots people, they explode like diamonds and spades and clovers. And the theme of the montage is playing cards. And I already feel that this is going to be a very different Bond film because it already has gotten my attention. And now with this music montage, it's absolutely earned my respect. And in case you're thinking this montage is very different from the traditional montages of Daniel Kleinman, this opening montage was created by Daniel Kleinman. And he was inspired by the original 1953 cover of Casino Royale, and you've probably seen this. It's a gray background with what looks like dripping 8 red hearts with tiny diamonds, which look like blood dripping. Daniel Kleinman wanted to make the entire montage in that motif. The song is You Know My Name by Christopher Cornell, and it's also a great song with a great musical theme. Now, the movie proper begins with Mr. White, or Quantum, meeting with General Stephen Obano, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And he has $100 million that he wants to invest for a safe, reasonable rate of return. And Mr. White from Quantum introduces Obano to Le Chiffre, who will invest his money where he can supposedly access it anywhere in the world. However, we know that Le Chiffre is quite a rascal. He will not invest it safely, but gamble rather recklessly on the stock market and lose it all thanks to James Bond's intervention, thus kickstarting the events of this movie. Well, General Obano is actually based on a real person, and the Lord's Resistance Army is a real organization. He is based on General Joseph Kony, who is one of Africa's most wanted militant warlords. And it is estimated that during his reign from 1987 to 2009, 66,000 children became child soldiers, and over 2 million people have been displaced by his forces. And in 2005, he was indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court in Hague, but was never caught. And he has still never been captured and is still at large to this day, although his organization is now a mere shadow of what it once was, and he is believed to be in poor health. So back to the movie, we then go to James Bond in Madagascar stalking a bomb maker named Molaka. And Molaka spots that James Bond is after him and makes a run for it. And we get Bond pursuing Molaka through a construction yard of Madagascar, and we're going to see in action sequences that audiences had never seen before 2006. So Malaka is younger and faster and more athletic, but Bond is calmer and smarter and far more strategic. And Malaka is played by French athlete Sébastien Foucan, who is the developer of parkour, aka free running. And I'd seen parkour before in a series of viral videos around this time, but at this time parkour really wasn't that well known. Now in 2003, a documentary about parkour called Jump London aired, and it highlighted Sébastien Foucan and others, and Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson saw Jump London and hired Sébastien Foucan to do parkour for this movie. And from here, parkour will explode onto the scene, and this movie was one of the catalysts. And after this movie, every other action sequence is going to have parkour in it. And the coolest part is when Bond and Malaka face off and they're climbing the construction crane and they go up hundreds of stories in the air, and already it's apparent that this is not a special effect. But there are two stuntmen out there doing this practically. And then we get a scene where Malaka shoots his gun, it jams, and he throws a gun at Bond, but Bond catches it and throws it back in Malaka's face. And this is great. This is great, James Bond. And now James Bond has already out Jason Bourne. And this is what we want. We want James Bond to be the best. We want the James Bond movies to be the best movies. And here we are getting the best. And from this point on, it is a non-stop roller coaster ride from beginning to end. And I'm already really liking this James Bond. He is more cruel. He is more sadistic. And I'm starting to agree with my friend that he is more likable. And Daniel Craig is very fascinating because you look at him from one angle, he's very awkward and ugly, and then you see him from another angle, and he's incredibly handsome and attractive. And I'm really intrigued by this guy. And the cool thing is that within 10 minutes of the movie, he's no longer Daniel Craig. I'm seeing James Bond on screen. Now Malaka makes it to the Nambutu embassy where he has diplomatic immunity, and the nation of Nambutu does not exist. It is a fictional country created for this movie. And Malaka runs into the ambassador's office, implying that the ambassador of Nambutu may be involved in the shenanigans. But Bond walks in after Malaka, punches the ambassador in the face, and has a standoff with the Nambutu security. Bond drops the ambassador's gun, grabs his own gun, and kills Malaka, and shoots a propane tank, which creates an explosion that allows him to escape without killing any of Nambutu's guards. Bond grabs Malaka's backpack, which has a bomb and a phone with the mysterious word, ellipsis. We then get a quick jump to a poker game on a yacht where we meet the villain Le Chiffre, who has an anomaly in his teardrop where he bleeds out of his left eye. And this is not from the novel. This is added for this movie and was the idea of screenwriters Neal Purvis and Paul Wade. And in a nice touch of detail, Le Chiffre's girlfriend Valenka, played by Ivana Milicevic, almost always has her hair styled to cover her left eye. She hides her eye in solidarity and deference to Le Chiffre's damaged left eye. Now I like how the game here played is not chemin de fer or baccarat like in the novel, but Texas Hold'em, which was huge in 2006 and is still huge today. After all, who even knows how to play chemin de fer? Or who even knows how to play baccarat today? But almost everyone knows how to play Texas Hold'em. 2006 was at the height of live television broadcasts of the World Series of Poker and the World Poker Tour, which really began in 2003 and exploded Texas Hold'em's popularity on the world stage. And this woman playing poker here is Madame Wu, played by Tsai Chin, who also played Ling in You Only Live Twice, the Chinese agent who sets up Sean Connery's Bond to be killed in the pre-credit action sequence. Madame Wu will return later in the movie during the main poker tournament. Le Chiffre finds out that Malaka has been killed in Madagascar, so whatever shenanigans that Malaka was involved in was orchestrated by Le Chiffre. And now Le Chiffre has to come up with a new plan. And we'll later find out that his plan is to borrow that $100 million from the Ugandan warlords, short 1 million shares of Skyfleet stock by purchasing put options worth $100 million, blow up the new prototype of Skyfleet's new airliner, and when the stock drops, sell his put options and make a fortune, pay the Ugandan warlords back, and pocket the rest. And now that Malaka the bomb maker is dead, Le Chiffre will have to find a new bomb maker. Chiffre asks when ellipsis expires, and this is a mystery which we'll later find out that ellipsis is the security code for the bomb maker to get inside the back of the airport to gain access to Skyfleet's new airline in order to blow it up. And then we go to London, where we meet M, who has obviously been chewed out by her superiors for one of her agents, Bond, blowing up the Nambutu embassy. Meanwhile, Bond has snuck into his old boss's house and is using her computer to track down the middleman who texted Malaka the code word ellipsis. And he traces the message to a hotel in Paradise Island in Nassau in the Bahamas. And when M asks,
"And how the hell did you find out where I live?"
he answers,
Same way I found out your name. I thought M was a randomly assigned letter. I had no idea it stood for...
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you killed.
And it shows us that Bond is very resourceful and an excellent spy, and M doesn't know that Bond actually has a lead, but Bond leaves M some crumbs, and she realizes that he has a lead that he's going to investigate. We then jump to these exotic locales in Nassau in the Bahamas, and Bond is driving a Ford Mondeo rental car, which was part of a multi-film deal signed in Die Another Day for $35 million. And in case you're wondering about Die Another Day's product placement deal with Aston Martin, well, Ford owned Aston Martin from 1991 to 2007, but sold it in 2007. And Ford also owned Jaguar in 1999, but sold that in 2008. But this is 2006, and as part of that deal, Bond will get to drive an Aston Martin later in this movie. And then we get a great hilarious scene where Bond is looking around to see how he can create a distraction. Then suddenly, a man mistakes Bond for a valet and gives him the keys to his Range Rover, which Bond now realizes he can use to create the distraction. He crashes into another car and even chucks the Range Rover keys into the trees. He then uses the distraction of the alarms to sneak into the security camera room, finds a recording to correspond to the exact date and time that Malaka received the text, and finds out exactly who sent that text. And it's a man named Alex Dimitrios, who apparently is a pretty angry, mean guy. He asks the hotel clerk about him, and she suggests, well, if he hasn't noticed it, maybe you shouldn't tell him. And Bond says,
But if I felt compelled to find him?
And she tells him that it is Alex Dimitrios. And Bond will send this information to MI6, who links Alex Dimitrios as an associate of Chiffre. And we get Bond coming out of the water in an homage to Ursula Andress' Honey Rider in Dr. No. And just as that scene turned Ursula Andress into a huge star, this moment will turn Daniel Craig into a huge international male sex symbol. And coming out of the water, he catches the eye of Dimitrios' wife, Solange. Now that night, he goes to the bar of his hotel to play poker with Dimitrios, and Bond wins Dimitrios' Aston Martin from him, and he drives Solange back to his place, which is at the same hotel. That night, Dimitrios meets with Chiffre, who's upset that Malaka is dead, and Dimitrios tells him that he has another bomb maker lined up. And he then heads to Miami to a Body Worlds exhibit to leave a bomb for the new bomb maker. Dimitrios notices that Bond is following him and pulls a knife on him, but Bond outfights him and kills him and leaves him sitting dead at the exhibit. But the new bomb maker has taken the bag and disappears, so Bond sends another text to see if anyone looks at their phone. Someone does, and Bond begins to tail him, which leads them to the Miami airport. And at the airport, we get a quick cameo by Richard Branson. Now the bomb maker ducks into a secure area, and Bond figures out that ellipsis is the code to get into the secure area. The bomb maker steals a fuel truck, which is attached to a bomb. He will crash the fuel truck into the new airliner, destroying it. And you see this stunt where a car is flung into the air by the jet's engines. This is not CGI, but this stunt was done practically. Now Bond takes a small bomb and secretly attaches it to the bomb maker and crashes the fuel truck before it can collide into the airplane. But the bomb maker doesn't know the detonator is attached to himself, and when he detonates the bomb, he blows himself up, and I love that smirk that Bond just gives to himself. So without the explosion, Skyfleet's new prototype is released, it's fine, and Skyfleet stock goes up. Chiffre's put options are worthless, and now he owns $100 million to dangerous Ugandan warlords. And I love the fact that Chiffre becomes desperate after he loses the Ugandan drug lord's money, and Mads Mikkelsen just captures that desperation. And I love it. And in a desperate attempt to win back $100 million to pay back the warlords, Le Chiffre arranges a high-stakes Texas Hold'em tournament, and Bond, who is MI6's best poker player, is sent to the poker tournament. And on the train to the poker tournament in Montenegro, we meet Vesper Lynd, who is in charge of the finances. She represents the treasury of MI6 and will give Bond the $10 million to enter Le Chiffre's poker tournament, and if needed, she will give him an additional $5 million buy-in. And they did something very interesting when they introduced her, because she introduces herself, she says,
"I'm the money."
And then James Bond responds,
Every penny of it.
and so we hear money and penny, and I feel that this was an intentional misdirect, because who wasn't thinking that this was going to be Moneypenny? Because when we hear money and penny, at least unconsciously, we relax and we completely discard any thought that this woman could betray Bond, because we think that she's going to be in the franchise now. You know, she's Moneypenny. And I had not read the book Casino Royale, and that's what made it all the more shocking and tragic when we find out that she is going to betray Bond. And I love the chemistry here between Bond and Vesper Lynd. It is electric, and the dialogue is great. And we learn some important things in this exchange. We learn that poker is a game of skill, mostly about reading people. And so they have a contest to read each other. He tries to read her and guesses that she's an orphan, but she turns the tables on him and guesses that he went to a wealthy school on someone else's charity, and that he too is also an orphan. And we also learn that she thinks that Bond has a nice butt.
You noticed.
It's such a great scene. I mean, they are fantastic. She's great. She's cute. She's adorable. She's sexy. She's intelligent. But there's this underlying innocence and vulnerability, which I really liked. And again, they just have this amazing chemistry together. And we believe that James Bond has fallen in love with her. And after that first meeting, James Bond gives us this kind of like look to himself, like it's kind of chuckle, a little smile. And I think this is why we like the Daniel Craig James Bond so much. So they arrive in Montenegro, they check into the hotel, and Bond has set up their cover. He's Mr. Beach, and Vesper's codename is Stephanie Broadchest.
I'm Mr. Arlington Beach, professional gambler, and you're Miss Stephanie Broadchest.
A comical reference to the trope of Bond girls having sexually suggestive names. And M has sent Bond an Aston Martin, a gorgeous-looking, brand-new 2006 Aston Martin DB5. And when he sees the note from M, he smirks.
I love you too, Em.
The scene also sets up an emergency defibrillator in the Aston Martin glove compartment, which will pay off later when he's poisoned. And we also meet their associate, Rene Mathis, who is MI6's agent in Montenegro, and he's really a cool character as well. And he's also discovered that the police chief of Montenegro has already been bribed by Le Chiffre, and that the two are working together, which may limit Bond here. So Mathis removes the police chief from the equation by having him arrested for bribery, using fake evidence that he's created that MI6 has been bribing the police chief. That is great. And the police chief is so smarmy, hanging out with these young women. But do you recognize the police chief? This is another cameo by Eon producer Michael G. Wilson. And Bond has gotten a dress for Vesper because he wants her so gorgeous that when the other players see her, they'll get distracted and stop thinking about the cards. This purple evening dress was made by Robert Cavalli, and the black evening gown she wears later was designed by Versace. And Vesper has a dinner jacket tailored for Bond. And she says,
There are dinner jackets and dinner jackets. This is the latter.
And she tells him that she sized them up when they first met. Now, this dinner jacket was part of a product placement deal with Brioni and costs $6,000. And when we see Bond sizing himself up wearing the dinner jacket, he looks great. And it's a quintessential James Bond moment. And so we have the poker game. This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie, where Bond is going to create his favorite drink, the Vesper Martini.
3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of quinoa lily, shake it over ice, and then add a thin slice of lemon peel.
And it's actually right out of the book. It's chapter 7 in the book, Casino Royale. And so this is an authentic Ian Fleming moment. And one of the great things is that when Bond orders this drink, everyone at the table says, oh, that sounds good. I'll have one. I'll have one too. And even Felix Leiter orders one and says,
My friend, Bring me one as well. Keep the fruit.
And everyone at the table orders one, and this really annoys Le Chiffre. And it's just such a hilarious moment. However, there is an anachronism about this drink in 2006. Remember, this is from 1953. And today, apparently, you can't get the same Kina Lillet anymore. In 1986, Kina Lillet actually changed to Lillet Blanc, which is no longer has quinine in it, that bitter taste, and is now much sweeter. We also meet Felix Leiter, and I think this is the first time where the Felix Leiter character isn't just a throwaway character, but here he's very interesting, and I love the way Jeffrey Wright plays him. And Jeffrey Wright will go on to portray Felix Leiter in 3 films and become the best Felix Leiter in the entire franchise. And it all started here. During a break in the game, Le Chiffre goes back to his room where the Ugandan warlords Obano and his henchmen are waiting for him, and they threaten to cut off his girlfriend's hand, and Le Chiffre promises that they'll have the money in 1 day after he wins the tournament. Bond also encounters the 2 Ugandans, and they fight, and he kicks one of them down the stairs, killing him, and he and Obano have a brutal fight down the stairs, and Bond eventually wins the fight with Vesper's help, and he kills Obano. And Mathis will use the dead bodies by placing them in the trunk of Le Chiffre's henchman's car and frames them for their murders. And he says,
"Being dead doesn't mean one can't still be helpful."
Now the game continues, and Bond and Le Chiffre play a hand, and when Bond goes all in, it turns out that Le Chiffre was not bluffing, but Bond was just fooled by his fake tell. And Le Chiffre taunts,
Oops. You must have thought I was bluffing, Mr. Bond.
And when the bartender asks Bond if he wants his drink shaken or stirred, our expectations are totally blown away when he answers,
Do I look like I give a damn?
Bond asks Vesper for the additional $5 million to buy in, but she refuses. And we think at this time it's because she's worried that he's going to waste MI6's money, but we don't know it at the time. But Vesper is secretly working for Quantum, who probably ordered her to take Bond out of the game. Bond is about to outright kill Le Chiffre, but Felix stops him and tells him that he is CIA and offers to stake him the money so that he can continue and buy back into the game. And I like the fact that Felix Leiter is also the mechanism for which Bond will continue in this film. And when Bond asks about the winnings, Felix answers,
Does it look like we need the money?
And you can see why their friendship would continue in the future. So Bond buys back in and continues in the game. But Bond is poisoned and begins to go into cardiac arrest. And he goes back to the car to get the defibrillator, but he can't hit the red button in time. But Vesper Lynd comes by and saves his life. Now, of course, we don't need to be a Joseph Campbell scholar to recognize the mythological significance of this moment in the movie, because we're now going to get the hero's journey. Bond has died and now risen from the dead, and so we know he's going to go back to the tournament, win, and conquer the poker game. And when he comes back, there's just a look on Le Chiffre's face. And you really got to give credit to Mads Mikkelsen for just doing a great job here. He's just open mouth, Bond says.
Well, I'm sorry. That last hand nearly killed me.
And it's so good. It's such a great line. And in the final hand, every player goes all in. One player has a flush, another a full house. Le Chiffre has a higher full house, but Bond has a straight flush. And he's won the game. Le Chiffre has lost. And Bond and Vesper have dinner and they flirt. But Vesper gets a text. And it's actually either Quantum or Le Chiffre, but she says it's from Mathis. And then she's taken by Le Chiffre, and this is why Bond suspects that Mathis may be the mole in MI6. He's too blinded by love to see that the mole is actually Vesper Lynd. When Bond goes to rescue Vesper, he crashes his Aston Martin. And this stunt was not done with CGI, but was a practical stunt. The stunt team practiced this with a BMW, and it went well, but when they tried it with a real Aston Martin, they couldn't get it to flip and roll. Therefore, they added an air cannon to the bottom of the Aston Martin, which would give it a push. The stunt team would have been very happy with 1 roll for the camera, and thought if they were lucky, they might get 3 rolls. However, when they performed the stunt, the car rolled 7 times, setting a Guinness Book of World Record for the most barrel rolls in a car. Bond gets captured by Le Chiffre. who tortures him for the code to access the 100 million. But Bond refuses to give him the code nor the money. And it's such a great cinematic moment. It's so simple and it's so painful to watch. And this really hit home to me how great this torture is. Because when was the last time Bond was tortured? Well, try to remember the last time. Well, if you think about it, he was tortured in just the last movie. Right? The previous movie, Die Another Day, he was captured by the North Korea and was tortured for 14 months. And yet we hardly remember that scene. But this, boy, we absolutely remember this scene. It's unforgettable. It stays with you. And this scene was in the original book by Ian Fleming, which was actually based on an actual torture technique that the Nazis would do to capture British spies during World War II. Apparently they'd take a carpet beater, which if you imagine is kind of like a hard hemp or weaved wiffle bat, and they would basically pound the testicles, and then they would carve it with a knife. And if you remember, Le Chiffre, after hitting the testicles, actually does have a knife. It was actually the movie that created the idea of a rope and swinging the carpet beater. And I think it is more effective for the screen. Again, it's just so painful to watch, and James Bond comes across as even more heroic just by being able to resist it. But suddenly, Mr. White suddenly appears, and Le Chiffre begs for his life and tells him that he can get the money out of Bond in just one day. But Mr. White says,
Money isn't as valuable to our organization as knowing who to trust.
And he kills Le Chiffre. Bond wakes up in a clinic, and Mathis and Vesper are there. And we see that Mathis slowly is beginning to put things together.
What? Why they left the two of you alive?
And we see that he's beginning to suspect that maybe Vesper might be a mole, and that the only reason why he was kept alive is so that he can get the money for Quantum, presumably to pay back the Ugandans without their leader, General Obano. However, Bond incorrectly suspects Mathis and has him arrested. And so now Bond and Vesper are free to pursue their love, or so Bond thinks. Now, how many people were surprised by this betrayal? Because I have to admit, I hadn't read the book, so while I was watching this, it was so tragic. And whenever I watch it again, it's just, you really see the guilt in Vesper Lynd's face. Of course, you don't notice it the first time you see it, but you definitely notice it on rewatch. And I have to give it credit to Ava Green for being able to capture the moments where they're giving each other a hug and she says, I'll see you in 30 minutes. But you just see the pain in her eyes. And I think she really nailed that scene. It's very painful to watch knowing that she is betraying James Bond. And we see the anger and pain in James Bond. And when Vesper Lynd dies, we see the confusion, the agony, the pain. It's incredible. And Daniel Craig just nails the scene. And now James Bond has become the cold-hearted killer of the franchise that we've all come to know and love. And he even tells them,
Job's done. The bitch is dead.
Oh, that is cold-blooded. And finally, the movie comes to an end. We see Mr. White answer a call from Vesper Lynd, and he shoots him with a sniper rifle, and now says the famous line,
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Cue the James Bond music theme song, and it is an instant classic. And that scene just gave me chills. And thus ends for me the greatest James Bond movie of the entire franchise. It was a complete out-of-body experience. And they nailed it. And this movie is just a series of great elements held together by an excellent story. Now, the official report of this budget was supposedly $150 million, the exact same amount as Die Another Day, but the real insiders claim that the true budget for Casino Royale was only $72 million, less than half the budget of Die Another Day. However, studios couldn't just say, yeah, this movie was much cheaper than the last one, so they had to claim that the budget was at least the same as the last one, and that's why the budget of $150 million was reported. But now, 20 years later, this $72 million figure seems to be the exact truthful budget of the film. The movie was a huge box office success. The movie made a whopping $616 million, blowing away any of the past Bond movies. The film also received positive reviews, with almost every site giving it 5 out of 5 stars. Roger Ebert gave it 4 out of 4 stars, and in 2006, it made almost every top 10 list for the best films of the year for almost every critic. It is still regarded as one of the best James Bond movies and holds an astounding 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, and is the 4th top-rated James Bond film right after GoldenEye, From Russia with Love, and Dr. No. And it is my personal #1 favorite James Bond film. And many famous ranking sites would agree. Ford magazine ranks at #1 out of 23 films. CBS ranks at #2 out of 24 films, second only to Goldfinger. And E! Online ranks at #2 out of 24 films, second only to Skyfall. Rolling Stone magazine ranks at #4, and Entertainment Weekly ranks at #6 out of 24 films. Daniel Craig himself received positive reviews, with many people, including myself, immediately ranked him in the top 2 James Bonds, along with Sean Connery. People began to debate in 2006 who was a better Bond, Sean Connery or Daniel Craig. Now think about it. He comes out of nowhere, he's in one film, and already people are comparing him to the great one, the great Sean Connery, the man who basically created James Bond. So even just to have this debate, I think it was incredible. So we're off to a great start. I'm already really excited for where this direction is going to go. And this was a shot in the arm for the James Bond franchise. An incredible start. However, Daniel Craig's turn as Bond will arguably be one of the most controversial. Because despite an amazing start with Casino Royale, he will have 2 of the greatest Bond movies in the history of the franchise, Casino Royale and Skyfall. And just when it looked like it will cement his status as arguably the best 007, rivaling Sean Connery, however, he'll also have 2 of the worst films in the entire franchise, Quantum of Solace and the absolutely dreadful Spectre, which actually would go back and ruin both Casino Royale and Skyfall. And then he would make the end No Time to Die, which would also become one of the most controversial films in the entire franchise. And so now many fans will often cite Daniel Craig as potentially one of the worst James Bonds of all time, which would have been a complete surprise in 2006 for those that fell in love with him here. In my next video, we're going to talk about one of those weaker James Bond films, the follow-up to Casino Royale, and the first true direct sequel of the franchise. So that ends this video on Casino Royale. Tell me what you thought of the movie in the comments below. And if you like this video, check out my other videos on the other James Bond movies, on the Star Trek films, on comedies like Popeye and Airplane, with new videos weekly. So that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.